She came to Colorado with three things: a stolen book, a false name, and a black wedding dress she had never chosen to wear. 6 weeks later, she stood in a ranch yard with a pistol aimed at the man behind her and did not move. This is the story of how she got there. She was standing over him when the story really began. Not at a train station, not in a letter, not in a faded photograph carried in a shirt pocket for 3 months, until the edges went soft and the image blurred at the corners where a thumb had pressed against it too many times during too many sleepless nights. The story began in the yard of a ranch in Colorado on a Sunday morning in August, when a woman in a black wedding dress stood between a bleeding man and the person who had put the bullet in him. Her hands were not shaking. Her voice was not shaking. The only thing moving was the wind off the mountains and the pages of a small leather journal she held open in front of her like a shield made of truth. To understand how she got there, you have to go back 6 weeks. You have to go back to the platform at Holt's Crossing Station on a July afternoon when the heat sat on the land like a stone, and a man named Silas Holt stood waiting for a woman he had never met, holding a photograph of someone who did not exist. Silas was 42 years old and looked every year of it, not in a ruined way, in the way that a good piece of leather looks after years of honest use, worn smooth in the right places, firm where it needed to be firm. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that told a story without a single word. Hands that had built fences and pulled calves and set the broken leg of a horse in a blizzard and dug a grave in frozen ground that was too small for anyone to dig without something breaking inside them permanently. He wore a blue work shirt that morning, the color of the sky an hour before full dark, and over it a brown leather vest that had belonged to his father and fit him like a second skin. He wore them because they were what he wore. There was no ceremony in it. There was no performance. Silas Holt had stopped performing anything for anyone a long time ago. The vest had been through enough seasons that the leather had softened to the particular suppleness of something that has been broken in by living. Not by effort, in wearing it required no thought whatsoever, which was the only kind of wearing he had patience for anymore. The photograph was small, barely larger than a playing card. A woman named Grace Aldrin, dark hair pinned up neat, a composed expression, eyes that looked directly at the camera with something that could have been confidence or could have been the particular stillness of a person who has learned to be still on command. He had carried it in his breast pocket for 3 months, long enough for the corners to bend soft, so long enough for the image to blur just slightly where his thumb had pressed against it during the nights when he lay awake in the cabin, with the sound of nothing all around him, wondering what kind of man puts an advertisement in a newspaper looking for a wife. The kind of man who buries his daughter and watches the woman he loved walk out the front door 6 months later because she said she could not live in a house full of ghosts. That kind of man. Doc Fenwick had told him it was grief, not madness, that made him keep Annie's room exactly as she had left it. Her shoes by the door, her drawings of horses on the wall, horses in colors that children choose when they are not yet trying to be accurate, purple horses and gold horses, and horses the particular improbable green of spring grass. Her stuffed bear on the pillow with the button eyes and the matted fur, and the infinite patient expression of a thing that has been loved past the point of presentability and is the better for it. Ruth had said it was both grief and madness, and then she had packed her trunk and left without looking back, and maybe she was right about that too. Either way, Silas had spent 4 years in a cabin with a girl's bedroom down the hall and the sound of nothing where there used to be everything. And eventually he had written the advertisement because Doc Fenwick had suggested it and because the silence had become something he could feel pressing against his ribs from the inside, a weight that had no shape and no name and no solution he had yet been able to find on his own. He had written to 3 women. Only Grace Aldrin had written back more than twice. Her letters were precise and dry and occasionally funny in a way that caught him off guard, the humor arriving sideways in the middle of a practical sentence the way unexpected light arrives through a gap in cloud cover. He had read them enough times that some of the phrases had worked their way into his memory without his intending to memorize them. He was not sure what that meant. He was not sure it meant anything. He put the photograph in his pocket and drove to the station and stood on the platform in the July heat and waited. He was not sure what he expected from the train. He was not sure he expected anything at all. The locomotive came around the bend, trailing smoke against the pale afternoon sky, and Silas stood with his hat in his hand the way he always did when he was uncertain, as if holding it gave him something to do with the restlessness he could not otherwise contain. Steam billowed across the platform when the train stopped. The world went white for a moment. Then it cleared. Passengers stepped down. A preacher with a worn Bible tucked under one arm and the distracted expression of a man composing his next sermon in his head. Two ranch hands already arguing about something that had not mattered when they started arguing and would not matter when they finished. A woman with three small children in the particular exhaustion of a person who has not slept in several days and has stopped expecting to. A man in a checked suit carrying sample cases who looked at the mountains as though he had never seen anything so large and wanted immediately to go somewhere that did not have them. No one who looked like the photograph. Silas waited. The conductor checked his watch. The platform emptied, the way platforms always empty quickly and without sentiment, until he was standing there alone with the faded photograph in the late afternoon sun pressing down on his shoulders in the particular cold that settles into a man's chest when he has hope for something and it has not arrived. Not the cold of temperature, the other kind, the kind that has nothing to do with weather. He turned to leave. That was when he heard it. One step on the metal stairs of the last car. A single footstep. Hesitant and slow, the kind a person makes when they are not entirely certain they want to arrive at where they are going. The kind of step that contains a whole conversation about doubt within the sound of it. He turned back. She was standing at the bottom of the steps, and she was nothing like the photograph. The woman in the photograph had been composed, poised. A woman who had arranged herself carefully for the camera and succeeded at it. The woman standing on the platform of Holt's Crossing Station looked like she had not slept in a week. She was thin in the way that speaks of meals skipped, rather than meals refused, thin in the way of a person whose body has been spending its resources on things other than eating, on vigilance, on the continuous, low-grade expenditure of being afraid. Her hair was brown and pulled forward on the left side of her face in a way that was not a style but a habit. The kind of habit a person develops when they have something to hide and have been hiding it long enough that the concealment has become automatic, performed without thought, the way you perform any act you have done 1,000 times. But none of that was the first thing Silas noticed. The first thing Silas noticed was the dress. It was black. Not the black of mourning clothes worn with appropriate solemnity for an appropriate occasion. Not the soft, faded black of a dress that had been washed too many seasons. This was the black of a wedding dress. Full-skirted, high-collared, with the kind of formal construction that speaks of expense and occasion and the understanding that certain garments are meant to mark certain days as different from all other days. A wedding dress the color of a funeral. She wore it the way someone wears something they have been forced to put on and have not yet found the moment or the safety to take off. The way a person wears a reminder that has been imposed from outside and has not yet been replaced by a choice made from within. She held a small valise in both hands pressed against her stomach, not carrying it, clutching it, the way you hold the only thing you have left when everything else is gone, and you have not yet had time to assess whether anything else might be coming. Her eyes found his. They were gray-green, the color of the mountains when clouds are moving in, and the light goes strange and flat and still, and you know something is coming, but you cannot yet tell what form it will take or how long it will last. In those eyes was something Silas recognized the way you recognize a road you have traveled in the dark. Not from seeing it clearly, from having been lost on it and found your way through it by memory and instinct alone. Fear, not ordinary fear, the deep kind, the kind that has been living inside a person so long it no longer announces itself when it arrives because it never truly left. The kind that has set up its furniture and started calling itself home. She took one step toward him, stopped. "Mr. Holt." Her voice was barely above a whisper, the kind of voice a person develops when they have learned through repeated and costly lessons that speaking at full volume invites consequences they have stopped being willing to pay. Silas swallowed. He thought about the name Grace Aldrin. He thought about the photograph in his pocket. He thought about how the woman standing in front of him was not the woman in that photograph in any way he could measure. He thought about the dress. He thought about the valise pressed against her stomach, like a wound she was keeping pressure on. He thought about the way she had stepped off the last car of the train, the last possible car, as though she had spent the entire journey deciding whether to get off at all. "That is me," he said. She nodded, and her eyes said more than her nod. Her eyes said she knew this was not the arrival she had promised him. Her eyes said she was sorry in the specific way of a person who knows an apology is inadequate but has nothing else available. Her eyes said, "Please do not send me back." Silas picked up her valise from where it sat beside her feet. Her hand tightened on the handle for a fraction of a second before she released it. He pretended not to notice. He was good at pretending not to notice things. He had learned that sometimes the kindest form of attention is the attention that does not declare itself. "Wagon is over here," he said. "About 4 miles to the ranch. Road is rough in places, but the view is worth it." He kept his voice low and even, the same way he spoke to horses that had been frightened. Not coaxing, not demanding, not performing reassurance in a way that announces itself as reassurance and therefore undoes its own work. Just steady, just present, just a voice in the air that means no harm and makes no claims and asks for nothing in return. She followed him at a distance of 3 steps, never closer. While the wagon rolled north through sage and scrub oak toward the foothills, 1,800 miles east in Philadelphia, a man named Harrison Vane sat in the study of a house that cost more than most men made in a lifetime and read a telegram that had just been delivered by a boy who had been tipped twice the going rate and told to forget he had come. Harrison Vane was 55 years old and had the kind of face that photographs well and that trusts poorly. Silver-haired, symmetrical, handsome in the carved, deliberate way of a man who has always understood that appearance is a form of currency and has invested in it accordingly carefully over many years the way you invest in anything you intend to use as leverage. His blue eyes were the color of winter sky on a clear day, the kind of clear that looks open and gives nothing away and contains behind it the particular cold that only comes when there is nothing between you and a very long distance. He read the telegram once, folded it carefully along its original crease, the fold precise and without hesitation, set it on the corner of his desk at a right angle to the edge, the way he set everything with the automatic exactness of a man who arranges his world, because arrangement is how he controls it. Then he reached for a pen and wrote a single name on a piece of paper. Cole Maddox. He folded that paper too and called for his man to have it delivered to the address he kept in the third drawer, on the left the drawer that was not locked, because nothing in it needed to be locked, because the man who knew to look there already knew what was in it. The court date was August 14th, 6 weeks. He was a patient man. He had always been a patient man. Patience was how you kept your hands clean when the work that needed doing was not the kind that kept hands clean. Patience was how you let other people make the mistakes, and let those mistakes become the story, and let the story become the record, and let the record say what you needed it to say. He stood and walked to the window and looked out at the garden that his groundskeepers maintained to a standard that expressed wealth without being vulgar. About it the standard of a man who understands that ostentation is a form of insecurity, and he thought about the desk drawer that was missing its contents. The locked drawer. The drawer that had been locked for 11 years and that he had checked every morning without exception, a habit so automatic he had stopped noticing. He performed it the way you stop noticing the sounds of your own house until one of them is absent. She had taken the journal. He stood at the window, and the garden was perfect, and the evening was pleasant, and something moved behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the pleasant evening or the perfect garden. Something that was not patience and was not calm and was not the controlled, cultivated equanimity of a man who had spent 30 years learning to never let his face say what his mind was doing. She had taken the journal. He had underestimated her. He would not do that again. The ranch came into view as the sun was dropping toward the western peaks, and Silas watched the woman beside him look at it with eyes that did not judge and did not hope, but simply took it in the way someone takes in information they are not yet sure how to use. Assessing, cataloging, filing it under a category that had not yet been named. It was not much. He knew it was not much. A cabin he had built with his own hands 12 years ago, still square and solid, but plainly a single man's work, a thing made for function rather than for impressing anyone. A barn that leaned a degree or two to the east, but had held through every winter he had thrown at it, which was the only standard a barn in this part of Colorado was ever truly tested against. A corral with 5 horses, all of them good animals, which was one thing he had never been willing to economize on. A vegetable garden that had gone half to ruin for reasons he had not examined too closely, which was to say for reasons he had examined too closely and found too painful to continue examining. The land was something else entirely. 160 acres of meadow and timber backed up against the Sangre de Cristo Range, with a creek running through it that never went dry, even in the worst summers, a creek fed by snowmelt from peaks that stayed white past the 4th of July and sometimes past the 5th. On clear mornings, you could see 50 miles in every direction. He had chosen this place because it felt like the edge of the world, a place where a man could disappear inside the size of the landscape if he needed to, where the scale of things put the size of your troubles in a different proportion. He had not considered until this moment that a woman might need the same thing. He showed her the cabin, the kitchen with its iron stove and the good light from the east window in the mornings, the sitting area with its 2 chairs and the fireplace that drew well, the small room at the back with the narrow bed and the clean sheets he had put on 3 days ago when he realized he was going to need to put on clean sheets, and the window that faced west toward the mountains, so that the last thing visible before dark and the first thing visible before dawn was the particular outline of those peaks against whatever color the sky was doing. He had scrubbed the place for 3 days before this, had put wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table, then felt foolish about it, removed them, thought about it for an hour, put them back because the alternative was a table with nothing on it, and that seemed worse. The room smelled of pine soap and something he could not name precisely. Years of quiet, maybe. Years of one person moving through a space that had been built for more people than were left to fill it. "This is yours," he said, opening the door to the small room. "I will sleep in the barn until you are settled. However long that takes, there is no clock on it." She stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a long moment, a genuine assessment, not a performance of gratitude and not a performance of acceptance. Then she looked at him with those storm-colored eyes studying his face the way a person reads a contract they have been burned by before searching for the clause that changes everything, the condition written in smaller print that reveals what the offer actually costs. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why the barn? This is your house." Silas considered the question. He answered it the only way he knew how, which was plainly and without decoration. "Because a locked door between us is worth more than any promise I could make tonight, and you do not know me yet well enough to know whether my promises are worth anything." Her mouth opened slightly, then it closed. Something moved through her expression that was too complicated to name and too private to attempt naming. She nodded, once turned away, and Silas pulled the door shut and walked out onto the porch and stood in the cooling evening air, while the sun finished its work behind the mountains and the sky went the color of a bruise in the process of healing, which is to say purple and gold, and finally the deep blue that precedes dark. He walked to the barn, he lay in the hay and listened to the horses breathing in the dark around him, and thought about the dress, the black wedding dress, about why a woman arrives for what is supposed to be the beginning of something in a garment that looks like grief made into fabric, about what that means and what it does not mean, and the distance between those two things, about the valise she had clutched against her body as though it were a wound, about the way she had frozen for that fraction of a second when he reached for her bag, a reflex so fast it was not a decision, just a body remembering that hands that come near things you are holding have historically not been coming to help. Then through the barn walls and the summer air, and the darkness that had settled into the valley while he lay thinking, he heard her crying, not the kind of crying that wants to be heard, not the kind that is a request for comfort or a bid for attention or a release that has made peace with being witnessed. The other kind, the kind pressed into a pillow or a fist or a folded arm, contained deliberately muffled, with the specific technique of a person who has learned that making noise in the wrong house has consequences. The kind of crying a person learns when they have been punished for the sound of their own distress, when they have been taught that their pain is an imposition, when the lesson has been delivered often enough and with enough authority that they have finally thoroughly learned it. He listened and did not move because he understood something about fear that most people never fully grasp. You cannot argue someone out of it. You cannot fix it with promises or good intentions or the right words delivered in the right tone at the right moment. You cannot fix it at all, not in the way that word implies completion. Fear that deep does not respond to what people say. It only responds slowly and skeptically, and never completely to what people do. Consistently. Over time. without expectation of gratitude or credit for the effort. He got up quietly, went to the well, worked the pump handle slowly to keep the sound down, let the water run into the bucket until he had enough. Heated it on the stove until it was warm, not hot, the temperature of something meant to comfort rather than to scald. Poured it into a tin cup, carried it through the dark yard to her door, set it on the floor outside without knocking, without leaving any evidence that it required a response. Went back to the barn. In the morning, the cup was empty. She was already in the kitchen when he came in at dawn. Standing at the stove, with her back to the door, still wearing the black dress, the coffee already made, and the smell of it filling the cabin with the first ordinary thing that had happened since she arrived. She did not turn around when she heard him enter. She continued what she was doing with the focused attention of a person who is performing normalcy with great care, testing whether it will hold. He had made a noise first, a deliberate scrape of his boot on the porch step before he came through the door. A small noise, barely noticeable if you were not listening for it, but she was listening for everything, and he knew that, and the noise was not accidental. On the third morning, she turned around before he was all the way through the door. She turned around and looked at him and said, "Good morning." The words came out almost steady. Not quite, but closer than the day before. Closer than the day before that. "Morning," he said, and sat down to eggs and biscuits that were better than anything he had made for himself in 4 years, and did not ask a single question, and ate slowly and then let the morning be what it was. The first week moved the way a creek moves in late summer when the snowmelt has slowed and the water is shallow and clear and finds its way around obstacles without making much noise about it. Quietly, without urgency, wearing things smooth in the process without anyone standing there watching it happen. She moved through the cabin like a woman who had spent years training herself to take up as little space as possible, light-footed in a way that was not grace but practice, careful about where she set things down. She ate small portions and watched the food on her plate with the expression of someone watching something they are not entirely sure belongs to them, the expression of a person for whom even small pleasures have historically come with conditions attached. On the fourth day, she asked if she could work in the garden. Silas looked up from the bridle he was mending, the leather worn through at the buckle in a place he had been meaning to address for 2 months. "You do not have to earn anything here," he said. "I am not earning anything." Her voice had an edge to it, the first edge he had heard from her, something underneath the careful, contained surface of how she had been speaking, something with more substance to it. "I need something to do with my hands, or I am going to lose my mind." He recognized that. The need to work, not because someone was demanding it, and not because it produced something necessary, but because stillness left too much room for the thoughts to move in and arrange themselves into configurations that were not useful. "Garden is yours," he said. "Tools are in the barn. There is a seed box on the shelf inside the door if you want to start anything new." She was outside within minutes. Silas watched through the window as she knelt in the dirt and went at the weeds with a focus that was something past determination and closer to necessity. Her hands knew what they were doing. This was not a woman who had spent her life in parlors. She had worked before with her body and with her hands, and she worked now with the particular intensity of someone who is using physical labor to accomplish something that has nothing to do with the physical task in front of them. By the end of the week, the garden was unrecognizable. Neat rows of turned earth, bean poles reset and strung with twine, the herb bed cleared and replanted with seeds from the box, a small fence built from scrap wood to discourage the rabbits that had been taking advantage of the neglect. That evening, she cooked from the first things the garden had yielded: wild onions she had found near the creek, herbs from the newly cleared bed, a roast chicken seasoned with rosemary that filled the cabin with a smell so familiar and so painful that Silas had to stop in the doorway and breathe through the tightness in his chest before he could move again. His mother had cooked with rosemary, then his wife, then no one. He had not smelled it in 4 years. "You all right?" she asked from the stove without turning around. She had heard him stop. She heard everything. "Fine," he said, sat down, ate. Did not explain why his throat was tight, because some things are not owed to a person you have known for 1 week, even when that person is starting to feel in some way he could not yet articulate, like something more than a stranger. After dinner, he reached for her plate to wash it. She reached for it at the same moment. Their fingertips touched for a fraction of a second, and the barest contact, the kind that would not have registered at all under ordinary circumstances. She pulled back as though she had touched something hot. Her eyes went wide and her breath caught, and Silas saw something move across her face that was not surprise, or was not only surprise. It was the body remembering what the mind was trying to be done with, the reflex older than any decision. He held up both hands, palms open, the way you show a frightened horse that you are carrying nothing and intend nothing and have arrived with empty hands. "I will clean up," he said quietly. "You cooked. That is how it works here. One person cooks, the other cleans. Fair is fair." She stared at his open hands. Her breathing slowed. The reflex receded, not gone, just back behind the line where it lived. "That is not how it worked before," she said. Her voice was flat, empty in the specific way of someone speaking about a world so different from fairness that the word fairness has lost its purchase, has become theoretical, a thing other people live in that you have heard described, but never inhabited. "It works that way here," Silas said. He turned to the basin and washed the dishes with his back to her so she could leave the room if she needed to, or stay if she needed to, or cry if she needed to, or just breathe without feeling watched. He heard the chair creak as she sat back down, heard her exhale, a long, slow breath, the particular sound of something being released from a cage it had occupied for so long that the release itself felt dangerous. When he walked out to the barn that night, he found a cup of warm water on the porch railing. Set there carefully, deliberately. No note, no explanation, none needed. He stood in the dark holding it for a long time and felt something shift in his chest that he did not try to name. On the sixth day, he found her in the barn reorganizing his medicine box. She had spread everything out on a hay bale with the quick, precise movements of someone who knew exactly what each item was for, who could identify a preparation by its container and its label, without hesitation, who moved through a medicine box the way a carpenter moves through a toolbox without searching. She held up a brown bottle without looking up. "Your laudanum is expired," she said, "and your iodine is half water. Someone diluted it at some point and then put it back on the shelf." She set the bottle down and picked up a roll of bandage. "These are cut too narrow. You have been wrapping with strips that cannot hold adequate pressure." Silas leaned against the barn door. "How do you know all that?" She froze. Not for long, just long enough for him to observe the calculation happening behind those gray-green eyes. How much to release? What to keep behind the door? How much truth is safe in this particular moment with this particular person who has not yet done anything to justify either fully trusting or fully not trusting? "I learned," she said carefully, "from books." That was not entirely true, and both of them knew it. A person does not move around a medicine box the way she did from reading about medicine boxes. A person moves that way from late-night shifts and difficult decisions made in the space between one heartbeat and the next, when someone else's survival was the thing in the balance. But Silas had made himself a promise about not pushing, and he intended to keep it. Then she reached up to put a bottle back on the high shelf, and her sleeve slid up her forearm, and he saw it, a scar running from her wrist to nearly her elbow. Not a cut, a burn, long and deliberate and unmistakable in its geometry. The kind of mark that does not come from a kitchen accident or a careless moment with a lantern. The kind of mark that comes from someone holding something hot against skin while the person attached to that skin cannot get away. Their eyes met. Hers went wide with the realization of what he had seen. She yanked her sleeve down fast enough that the fabric tore slightly at the seam. Her face went the color of ash. Neither of them spoke. The barn was silent except for the horses breathing and a wasp working at something in the rafters, and the creek running on the other side of the fence line, doing what it had always done regardless of what happened on this side of it. Silas held her gaze. He did not look away. He did not look at her arm. He looked at her eyes and held them steadily and made sure she could see that nothing in his face had changed. No pity, which would have been an insult. No horror, which would have been a performance. No curiosity demanding to be satisfied, which would have been a violation. Just this in his eyes: if she could read it, "I see you. I see what was done to you. It does not change what I see." She turned away and put the medicine box back together with hands that were not entirely steady, and then she walked out of the barn without a word and crossed the yard to the cabin, and went inside, and Silas stayed where he was until the horses had settled again. That night, he sat on the porch and thought about the dress and the valise and the scar and the way she had asked on the very first wagon ride whether anyone knew she was coming here. He thought about the way she checked the road behind them. He thought about all the small, careful things she did that were not the habits of a woman who had been living freely. He thought about the growing distance between the woman in the photograph and the woman sleeping in his cabin, a distance that was not disappointing, but was, if he was honest with himself, becoming a concern of a different and more serious kind. She was running. He had known it from the moment he watched her come down those train steps. He had known it the way you know incoming weather before it arrives from a quality in the air rather than from any visible sign. The next morning, he rode into town and went to Doc Fenwick's office before the doctor had finished his first cup of coffee and told him what he was going to say to no one else. I knew she was using a false name from the first moment, he said. Doc Fenwick, who had been practicing medicine in this part of Colorado for 35 years and had arrived at the age of 65 with a thorough and unsentimental understanding of what human beings were capable of doing to each other and to themselves, looked at Silas over the rims of his reading glasses with the unhurried attention of a man who has heard most things and is prepared to hear the rest. And you did not ask her about it. No. Why not? Silas turned his hat in his hands, looked at the window, looked at the mountains beyond it, the ones that had been there before this town existed and would be there after it was gone, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the difficulties of the people living in their shadow. Because the answer did not matter as much as her being there, he said. Doc Fenwick was quiet for a moment. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at Silas with the expression of a man who has just received information that confirms something he already suspected and finds the confirmation neither surprising nor simple. She is going to tell you when she is ready, he said. I know. And when she does whatever it is, I know. Oh, no, Silas said again. He rode back to the ranch in the afternoon heat and said nothing to her about what he had done or where he had been. She said nothing about the scar or about the medicine box or about anything that mattered. They ate dinner together in the working silence of two people who have made, without declaring it, an agreement to let things arrive in their own time rather than forcing them into an arrival they are not ready for. The truth came on the 8th day. Silas was at the kitchen table cleaning his rifle, a task he performed with the careful, methodical attention he gave to all things mechanical, when she sat down across from him. She did not bring anything at first. Just herself, with the look on her face of a person who has spent a considerable amount of time preparing to say something and has finally arrived at the place where the reasons not to say it have been exhausted. What is your name? He asked before she could begin. She looked at him. The question had arrived quietly, without accusation, without the particular edge of a man who has been deceived and wants the deceiver to know that he knows. Just the flat, steady firmness of a man who has given a person every possible room to move in and is now asking for the one thing he has not required. Della, she said, Della Weston. The name settled into the kitchen like something solid arriving. Real in a way that Grace Aldrin, with her neat handwriting and her composed photograph, had never entirely been. Tell me, he said. She looked at her hands, at the fingers that had healed at angles that nature had not intended, because two of them had been broken and never properly set. At the scar she usually kept covered. She took a breath that shook on the way in and steadied on the way out, the breath of a person who has decided and is now simply executing the decision. And she told him, not everything, not yet, but enough. His name was Harrison Vane, Philadelphia. Money that had started in textiles and moved into investment and eventually into the kind of accumulation that stops being about money and becomes about what money permits a man to believe about himself. A house with the curtains always drawn. A household staff who had learned without being told explicitly which sounds from upstairs required them to suddenly be very busy somewhere else. 5 years of Della making herself smaller, quieter, less visible, because she had learned through repetition and consequence that the less he noticed her, the less she became a surface onto which he projected the things inside him that needed somewhere to go. She told him about the 5th anniversary. Harrison had a ritual. Once a year on the date of their wedding, he laid out the dress. The black wedding dress, which had been white on the day she wore it for the first time, and which he had dyed black himself in the first year of their marriage, for reasons he described to her as a aesthetic preference, reasons she had come to understand over time, and through painful education were something else entirely. He required her to wear it for the evening. He called it a celebration. She had learned early and at cost not to argue about what he called things in that house. On the 5th anniversary, he had come home from a business dinner. She had said something. She still did not know what. Maybe she had looked at him wrong. Maybe she had not looked at him enough. He had beaten her until she could not stand, and then he had put his hands around her throat, and she had looked into his eyes and understood with a terrible clarity that arrives when the body finally grasps what the mind has been refusing to accept, that this was not punishment. This was conclusion. He had reached the end of something and had decided to end it. A girl named Ada, 16 years old, who earned $2 a week pressing shirts and cleaning floors and making herself invisible in the way that girls in her position learned to make themselves invisible, had walked through the wrong door at the wrong moment. Harrison had released his hands, not because he was sorry, because he had an audience, and an audience changed the nature of what he was doing from private to documented, and documentation was the one thing he had spent 30 years carefully avoiding. That night, Della had taken what she could carry, which was not much. Money she had been hiding for months inside the spine of a book that Harrison would never read because it did not have his name in it, a change of clothes, and one other thing, a small leather journal she had taken from the desk in his study, the locked desk, the desk whose key she had found 6 months earlier by accident and had never mentioned finding because she had understood without being told that the finding was information, and information in that house was leverage, and leverage was the one thing she was never supposed to have. She put the journal on the table between them. "I did not know what it was when I took it," she said. "I took it because he kept it locked. I thought anything he locked away might be worth having." She opened it to the first pages, columns of numbers, names of men alongside dates and dollar amounts, judges, senators, city officials and state officials and federal officials. 20 years of systematic corruption recorded in Harrison Vane's careful, precise handwriting, as though he were maintaining the ledger of a legitimate enterprise, because to his way of thinking, there was no meaningful distinction between the two. Then she turned to the middle of the journal, page 47. She turned it so Silas could read it himself and watched his face while he did. He read it. He read it twice slowly, the way you read something you want to be certain you have understood correctly before you respond to it. The entry was dated 11 years earlier. A woman named Eleanor, Harrison's first wife, who had, according to the death certificate filed with the city of Philadelphia, fallen down a flight of stairs. Who had, according to what was written on page 47, in the same precise handwriting as the bribe records, threatened to bring what she knew to the appropriate authorities. Whose death had been followed 6 weeks later by a payment of $400 to a man whose occupation was listed elsewhere in the journal as county coroner. Silas closed the journal. He set it on the table. He put his hands flat on the wood on either side of it and looked at the grain for a long moment. Something was moving through him that was not ordinary anger. Ordinary anger burns fast and makes noise and spends itself quickly. This was the other kind, the kind that takes hold, the way fire takes hold, of green wood slowly and completely, and with the particular thoroughness of something, though, that will not be easily extinguished once it has found its depth. "He is coming for this," Della said. Her voice was very quiet. "Not for me, not because he wants me back. He is coming for this journal. Because if this reaches the right people, he does not merely lose his reputation or his position. He goes to prison for murder." She met his eyes across the table. "I am not just a woman who ran away from a difficult marriage," she said. "I am a witness, and Harrison Vane does not leave witnesses alive." The lamp between them threw their shadows against the wall. Outside, the Colorado night had settled into the valley, and the mountains were shapes against a sky going dark, and somewhere on the road between Philadelphia and this ranch, a man had written a name on a piece of paper, and a man whose name was on that paper was already making his arrangements. Silas looked at the journal. Then he looked at her. At the woman who had arrived in a black wedding dress with a burn scar on her arm, and gray-green eyes that had seen too much in a valise held against her body like the last piece of armor left. At the woman who had revived his garden and reorganized his medicine box and left a cup of warm water outside his door and cried into her pillow in the practiced, muffled way of a person who has been taught that her pain is an imposition. At the woman who had sat across from him for 8 days and asked for nothing and given everything she had available to give and was now sitting here telling him the truth at a cost he could only begin to estimate. "You have been here 8 days," he said. "In that time you have fed me, kept this house, brought that garden back from nothing, and not once asked me for a single thing in return." He paused. "I do not care what name you used in those letters. I care that you are here and that someone hurt you, and that whoever that someone is, he does not yet know what kind of mistake he made when he let you get on that train." Something shifted behind her eyes, something that had been locked for a very long time, beginning just barely to consider whether unlocking might be possible. "You do not know what he is capable of," she said. "No," Silas said, "but I know what I am." He held her gaze and did not look away. "You are safe here, Della. Whatever your name, wherever you came from, whatever is coming toward us right now on the road, you are safe on this land. That is not a promise I am making because you need to hear one. It is a promise I am making because I cannot make any other kind." Outside, the creek moved over stones on its way downhill. The horses shifted in the corral. The stars were out over the peaks, old and indifferent and very far away from the problems of the people living beneath them. Della Weston looked at the man across the table from her, at his blue work shirt and his brown leather vest, and his hands flat on the wood beside the journal, at the face that had not flinched when it saw her scar and had not pushed when she was not ready, and had left a cup of warm water outside her door every single night for 8 days without ever once suggesting that the gesture entitled him to anything. "All right," she said, 2 words, but they carried the weight of something being set down. Something heavy and long carried set down at last. That night, for the first time since she had stepped off the train, Della Weston did not cry. And 1,800 miles east, a man named Cole Maddox read a note with a single instruction on it, packed a single bag with the efficiency of someone who has done this before and expects to do it again, and booked passage on the next train heading west. The 6 weeks had begun. The second week arrived the way second weeks do after a first week of something difficult, without announcement, without the particular weight of the new that makes the first week of anything feel heavier than subsequent weeks. The days took on a shape that was not yet comfortable but had at least become recognizable the way a path becomes recognizable, not because it has been marked or maintained, but because you have walked it enough times that your feet begin to know it before your eyes do. Della moved differently now. Not freely, not yet. That would take longer than 2 weeks longer, perhaps, than any specific measure of time, because some things do not heal on schedules, and the people who tell you they do are either optimists or strangers to the particular injury in question. But differently. The quality of her wariness had changed. It was still present, still operational, but it had begun to distinguish between things that warranted it and things that did not. A distinction that fear, when it has been total and constant for long enough, loses the capacity to make. She still woke before dawn and had the coffee made before Silas came in from the barn. She still positioned herself in any room so that she could see both the door and the window, simultaneously, the automatic spatial calculation of a person who has learned that exits matter. She still slept with the valise on the floor beside her bed, where her hand could find it in the dark without having to wake fully to look. These things did not change. They would not change quickly, and Silas understood that the way he understood everything about frightened things, you do not measure healing in large gestures. You measure it in the distance between where something was yesterday and where it is today. Sometimes that distance is inches. Sometimes it is less. But there were signs. She had started leaving her door open a crack at night, not wide, just enough to let the sounds of the house come through. The settling of the old wood in the cooling air, the wind through the eaves, the particular quality of silence that belongs to a place where no one is coming through the door with bad intentions. She had started looking up when he entered a room instead of continuing whatever she was doing and absorbing his presence gradually the way you absorb something you are not certain about. She had started just occasionally saying things that were not strictly necessary for the management of the household. Observations about the garden. Questions about the horses, their names and ages and temperaments, asked with the interest of a person who genuinely wants to know, rather than a person making conversation, because conversation is required. On the 10th day, he came in from the north fence line and found her sitting at the kitchen table with Annie's old primer open in front of her. She had found it on the shelf in the sitting room where it had lived unopened for 4 years. She looked up when he entered, and there was something careful in her expression. The expression of a person who has done something they are not certain they had the right to do. "I hope it is all right," she said. Silas looked at the primer, at the cover worn soft with small hands and years of use, at the pages he had not been able to open for 4 years because opening them felt like pressing on something that was not done healing and would not be rushed. "It is all right," he said. He hung his hat on the peg by the door, poured himself coffee, sat down at the far end of the table, a deliberate distance enough to make it clear that her presence with the book was not an intrusion that required managing. He drank his coffee and did not say anything further. After a while, she turned a page. Joseph Crow came down from the hills on a Thursday morning in the second week, riding at a pace that was not quite urgent, but was not casual either. The pace of a man who has something that needs to be said and has made the decision to say it. Silas was at the corral when he saw him coming over the eastern ridge. He opened the gate and walked out to meet him. Joseph was Jicarilla Apache, born to the land this ranch sat on the edge of, though he had been living in these hills long enough that most people in Holt's Crossing had stopped thinking of him in terms of origin and started thinking of him in terms of who he was, which was the most reliable person Silas had ever known. They had found each other 8 years ago during a blizzard that came in hard and fast and had no business being as severe as it was. The kind of trust built across 3 nights of keeping a fire going against a storm that intends to kill you is not the kind that requires regular maintenance. Joseph dismounted with the economy of motion that characterized everything he did and looked at Silas with his flat, patient eyes. "Man in town," he said, "arrived 2 days ago, staying at the boarding house." "What kind of man?" "The careful kind. Asks questions by making the other person feel as though they are the one with the questions." Joseph's gaze moved briefly toward the cabin. "He has not asked about her by name. He has asked about you, about the ranch, about whether you live alone, about whether anyone has come to visit recently." Silas was quiet. The morning sun was at the top of the eastern ridge, and the light was the pale gold of high summer, and everything looked exactly as peaceful as it was not. "What does he look like?" "City clothes but not new, good boots that have seen real use, hat that belongs to a working man, except his hands have never done working man work." Joseph paused. "He drinks tea, not whiskey. The widow who runs the boarding house has decided he is the most agreeable man she has met in years. That worries me more than the questions. That is why I came down." Silas stood with his hands on the corral fence and looked at the mountains for a moment, at the peaks that were doing what they always did, standing there solid and enormous and entirely unhelpful in any practical sense. Then he went inside. Della was at the stove. She heard his boots on the floor and turned around before he reached the kitchen because she had learned by now to read the quality of his step when it was carrying something. He told her what Joseph had said. He watched her face process it. She did not go pale. She did not move to the window to check the road. She stood with the dishcloth in her hands and her gray-green eyes moving through the information with the rapid, precise focus of someone who has already run this scenario many times in her mind and is now locating which version of her preparation applies. "Cole Maddox," she said. "You know him, not personally. I know what he is." She set the dishcloth on the counter with the deliberateness of someone organizing their thoughts into a usable order. "Harrison keeps 2 kinds of men available to him. The first kind is direct. They show a photograph, offer money, lean on people until something comes loose. They work well in cities where there are always people who need money and have information and are willing to exchange one for the other." She paused. "The second kind is different. They find out what matters to you, and then they work with that. They do not threaten outright. They suggest. They arrange a situation where you understand perfectly well what is going to happen without anything having been said that could be documented or attributed." Silas listened. "Harrison sends the first kind when he wants information and is willing to be obvious about wanting it. He sends the second kind when he wants results and has decided that being obvious is a liability." She met Silas's eyes. "Cole Maddox is the second kind. Harrison calls him a fixer. The word he uses to himself is probably something less polite." "How long have you known about him?" "Long enough to know that his being here means Harrison has stopped trusting the ordinary machinery to work in his favor." She was quiet for a moment. Cole Maddox does not get sent to retrieve a runaway wife. He gets sent to retrieve leverage. Outside, the wind picked up in the pine trees at the edge of the property, that low, whispering sound it made before it came in seriously off the mountains. Joseph's horse shifted in the corral. A hawk called once from somewhere over the north pasture and then was silent. Della looked at the valise by the bedroom door. Then she looked at Silas with something in her expression that he had not seen there before. Not fear, not the considering calculation of someone assessing a threat. Something else, a decision that had already been made and was now being declared. "I want to go to town," she said. Silas looked at her. "I want to go to town and I want him to see me," she said. "Not hiding, not waiting for him to find me. I want him to look at me and understand that what he came here expecting to find is not what is here." Della. "I spent 5 years making myself invisible because I believed it was the only way to remain safe. It did not keep me safe. It made me easier to manage." Her jaw set in the way he had come to recognize as the forward edge of a decision she had already moved past, reconsidering. "I am done being invisible. I was done the moment I stepped off that train." Silas looked at her for a long moment, at the set of her shoulders, at the steadiness in her eyes, at the woman who had arrived 2 weeks ago clutching a valise like it was the last solid thing in the world, and was now standing in his kitchen, proposing to walk directly at the thing she had come 1,800 miles to put distance between herself and. He went to the barn and saddled 2 horses. Holt's Crossing at midday in July was the kind of quiet that descends when the heat becomes serious about itself. The dogs moved to the shade and stayed there. The horses at the hitching post stood with their heads low and their eyes half closed. 3 men on the saloon porch occupied chairs with the boneless ease of people who have no particular plans for the afternoon and are at peace with that. Something changed when Della Weston walked down the main street. She wore the black dress because it was what she had. She had brushed her hair back from both sides of her face, no curtain, nothing hidden. The scar at her left temple, the one still fading from the night she had left, now a pale pink line, was visible in the afternoon sun. She walked with her chin level and her eyes forward, and if her hands were not entirely steady at her sides, then her stride contained no uncertainty whatsoever. Silas rode a half-length behind her to her left, his right hand resting on his thigh, his posture that of a man who is present without pressing and available without hovering. She found Cole Maddox before he found them. He was sitting outside the boarding house in a wooden chair tilted back against the clapboard wall, a cup balanced on his knee, watching the street with the relaxed peripheral attention of a man who has trained himself to see things without appearing to look at them. He was perhaps 40, lean through the jaw, with the controlled posture of someone who has learned that how you hold yourself tells people things you may not want them to know, and has adjusted accordingly. His clothes were good without announcement. His hat was pulled low. He saw Della. Something moved across his face. A recalibration. The shift of a man whose assessment of a situation has just been revised by new information. He had come to this town expecting to be the one doing the observing. He had not planned for the subject of his observation to observe him back from across the street and then walk directly toward him. Della climbed the boarding house steps and stopped 2 steps below the level where he sat, which put them at eye level, which was not an accident. "Mr. Maddox," she said. Her voice carried in the still air, the way sounds carry at altitude, clearly and without effort. He set down the cup, stood, removed his hat with a gesture that managed to be simultaneously courtesy and performance, and perhaps the very early beginning of something that was neither. "Ma'am, I don't believe we've been introduced." "We haven't. My name is Della Weston. I understand you have been asking questions about me and about this town." A beat, small and controlled, but there. "I have been getting to know a new place," Cole said. "Standard practice when I'm somewhere unfamiliar. You have been asking about Silas Holt and whether he lives alone and whether anyone new has come to stay with him recently." She reached into the pocket of the black dress and withdrew the journal. She opened it to the first page and held it up long enough for Cole to read 3 lines. Names, dates, amounts. She closed it and put it away. "I want you to tell Harrison Vane something when you communicate with him next." Cole Maddox looked at her with the expression of a card player who has realized the game is different from the one he sat down to play. "I am not in direct communication with. Tell him I am not the woman he married." Her voice was even and unhurried, and it carried more weight than a raised voice would have carried. That woman was too afraid of her own voice to use it above a whisper. This one is not. Cole's eyes moved to the pocket where the journal had gone, then to Silas on horseback with his hand near his thigh, then back to Della. Mrs. Vane, Weston. She did not blink. My name is Della Weston. I was Della Weston before Harrison Vane, and I am Della Weston now that I have left him. You may tell him I said so, and you may tell him I said it plainly. Cole Maddox replaced his hat. His expression had gone to the neutral surface that professional men of his kind maintain when they need time to reassess. He had arrived in Holt's Crossing expecting to find a frightened woman who could be maneuvered. He had found something that required a fundamentally different approach, and he was honest enough with himself to know it. Good afternoon, Miss Weston, he said. He went inside. Della stood at the foot of those steps and breathed for a moment at a single controlled breath, and then turned and walked back across the street to where Silas waited with the horses. He saw her hands trembling as she reached for the saddle. Not much, just enough to tell him what the steadiness of the preceding 5 minutes had cost. He said nothing about it. He kept it in a place he would return to later when she was ready for it to be acknowledged. They rode back toward the ranch in silence, and the mountains kept their watch in every direction, and the road unrolled before them through the sage and the heat shimmer, and Della looked forward the entire way and did not once look behind her. She found Nettie Burke on a Tuesday afternoon, 5 days after the encounter with Cole Maddox. Silas had sent her into town with the wagon for supplies. Not because the supplies were urgent, because he had been watching her rebuild her sense of safety the way a person rebuilds anything structural from the ground up, testing each layer before adding the next, and he understood that going to town alone and coming back unharmed was a layer she needed to test. She came back with the flour and the coffee and the soda and one other thing she had not been sent for. Silas was at the barn door when she drove in. He watched her climb down and stand for a moment with her hands at her sides, looking at the ground, the posture of a person arranging their thoughts before using them. There is a girl at the boarding house, she said, 16 years old. Her name is Nettie Burke. She does the cleaning, the cooking, the mending, has done it since she was 13. Silas waited. The man who owns the boarding house is not her employer in any legitimate sense of that word. Della's voice found the clinical flat register she used when she needed distance from what she was saying. He controls what she earns and where it goes. He controls where she owes and who she speaks to. He has told the town she is his ward. She paused. She is not his ward. She is a girl who arrived on an orphan train with no one to speak for her, and he recognized that as an opportunity. The evening light was long and amber across the yard. A meadowlark was working the fence line with the cheerful industry of a creature that does not know what is happening, all 20 yards away. How old is she? Silas asked. 16. She has been there since she was 13. Della's voice was flat and precise in the specific way of someone holding something very large, very tightly. She does not know she has options available to her. She cannot read well enough to understand any document that might describe those options. She cannot write well enough to contact anyone outside this town who might help her exercise them. Silas said nothing. He watched Della's face. She sat across from me at the counter in the general store, Della said. She was buying boot blacking. She kept her eyes down the entire time. She held her money in both hands and counted it twice to make sure the amount was exactly right, not a cent more than what she had been given, because a cent more would mean she had something she was not supposed to have. She stopped. I have sat in that exact posture, at that exact counter with that exact money in my hands, Silas. The only difference between her and me at age 16 is that I had a family, and she does not. The meadowlark moved to another fence post. What do you want to do? Silas asked. I want to teach her to read, Della said. I want to teach her to write. I want to give her what no one gave me, which is the knowledge that the walls she is living inside are not as permanent as she has been led to believe. She paused. And I want Doc Fenwick to know what is happening in that boarding house, because some things cannot wait for a better moment. Some things just need to be said to the right person. The following morning, Della drove back into town and spoke to Doc Fenwick for 45 minutes. Then she walked to the boarding house and spoke to Nettie Burke for 20. She came home, put the horse up, and went directly to the kitchen table where she spread out paper and a pencil and began writing out the alphabet from memory in large, clear letters. The following afternoon, Nettie Burke appeared at the end of the ranch road. She was thin and watchful and moved through space the way Della had moved through it 3 weeks ago, with the careful economy of someone who has learned that taking up too much room invites correction. She looked at Della's black dress and did not ask about it. She sat down where Della indicated across from the paper and the pencil and looked at what was in front of her. "We are going to start with your name," Della said. Something moved across the girl's face. Not quite hope, because hope requires practice, and Nettie Burke had not had much opportunity to practice it. But the thing that lives in the territory adjacent to hope, the thing that precedes hope when a person first starts to believe that hope might be worth the risk. She picked up the pencil. She held it wrong at first, and Della corrected her hand gently, and she tried again. Some evenings, Nettie stayed past the time she was expected back, sitting at that table with the lamp burning between them, copying sentences that Della set out for her. Among the things Della had her copy written out in clear block letters at the top of a practice sheet was the address of the United States Marshal's office in Denver. "Why this?" Nettie asked one evening. "Because a person should know who to write to before they ever find themselves needing to write," Della said. "Copy it until it becomes automatic, until your hand knows it the way your hand knows your own name." Nettie looked at the address. Then she bent over the paper and copied it again. Cole Maddox came back on a Friday. Not to the ranch this time. He was sitting on the bench outside the general store when Della brought the wagon in with the week's supply list. He was not performing coincidence. He was simply there with his hat in his hands and his eyes carrying something they had not carried the first time. Something that was not professional assessment and was not the careful neutrality of a man keeping his cards close. Della stopped in front of him. She did not step back. "I owe you something," Cole said, "that I have owed someone for a very long time. I am only now understanding that you may be the person I owe it to." She waited. Cole looked at his hat, then at the mountains that ran along the western edge of the valley, then at her directly in the way of a man who has decided that oblique approaches are done with. "I was there when Eleanor died," he said. The words arrived and stayed. "I was on Harrison's payroll then as I am now." He called it a domestic incident. He said she had been drinking. He said the staircase in that house was steep and she had always been careless near it. His voice was controlled, but something underneath it was neither. "I saw the marks on her. I have seen enough of that kind of thing to know what a fall downstairs produces and what it does not produce. The marks on Eleanor Vane were not consistent with a fall." He stopped. "I wrote in my report that I found nothing inconsistent with accidental death. A woman came out of the general store carrying a basket and glanced at them briefly and went on her way without slowing." "I have had 11 years to tell myself things about that report," Cole said. "I have told myself I had insufficient evidence to prove anything in a legal forum. I have told myself that my word against Harrison Vane's word in Philadelphia was not a contest with a favorable outcome. I have told myself that the result was already determined before I arrived, and that my report was irrelevant to what was ultimately concluded." He paused. "I have been very productive with those stories." He was quiet for a moment. "What is in that journal, the entry about Eleanor? Is it in his own handwriting?" "Yes." "The full account, enough to remove every question that might otherwise be called reasonable about what happened to her?" Cole nodded. The nod of a man who has been standing at the edge of a decision long enough that the standing has become its own kind of torment, and who has finally simply stepped off. "I cannot undo the report I wrote," he said. "I understand that. I am not asking you to think well of me for what I intend to do now, because there is nothing admirable about requiring 11 years to do the right thing. I am simply telling you that when the moment arrives, I will not be standing where I have been standing." He looked at her. "Whatever you need from me when the time comes." Della looked at him for a long time, at the lines at the corners of his eyes, at the way he held his hat with both hands, not as a courtesy gesture this time, but as something to hold on to the way you hold on to something solid when you are not certain of your footing. "What changed?" she asked. "What made now different from the 11 years before now?" Cole was quiet for a moment. He looked at the mountains again with the expression of a man consulting something that does not answer in language. I watched a woman in a black dress walk across a street in broad daylight to face the man who had been sent to find her, he said. And I understood watching her that I had never in 11 years done anything that required a fraction of that kind of courage. He replaced his hat. I expect we will speak again, Miss Weston, before this is finished. He stood, walked away down the street with his hands in his coat pockets and his shadow stretching long behind him in the afternoon sun. Della stood outside the general store for a long time after he had gone, watching the space where he had been. The third week settled over the ranch with the quality of a held breath. Doc Fenwick had spoken to the circuit marshal about the situation at the boarding house. Arrangements for Nettie Burke were being made carefully and slowly, the way arrangements in small towns need to be made when everyone knows everyone and the wrong word in the wrong ear undoes the right work. Nettie came to the ranch on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She was quicker than she appeared or than she knew herself to be, because intelligence that has been suppressed and unused for years does not disappear, but compresses, waiting for the room to expand into. She learned the letters in a week. She began connecting them into words in the second. She wrote her name on the third attempt and sat looking at it on the paper with the particular stunned expression of someone who has just discovered they are capable of something they were told was beyond them. Della said nothing. She sharpened the pencil and put a fresh sheet in front of Nettie. Again, she said. On the evenings after Nettie had gone back to town, Silas and Della sat on the porch and let the day come down around them. The sun behind the mountains, the first stars over the eastern ridge, the coyotes in the hills calling with the particular loneliness of creatures who are always searching for something that does not quite answer back. On a Thursday evening in the third week, Silas told her about Annie. He had not planned to. It arrived the way things arrive when they have been waiting long enough, sideways and without warning, through a gap left open by a question that had been asked with the right kind of care. Della had been watching the closed door at the end of the hall for 3 weeks. She had not asked. She had been living in this house and walking past that door twice a day, and she had made the decision not to ask the way you make a decision not to press on a wound you can see that someone else is carrying. But on the third Thursday, she asked, and she asked obliquely with the particular gentleness of a person who knows from experience what it costs to be asked about the things you lock away. The doctor in town mentioned once that you had a daughter, she said. Silas's hands went still on the piece of leather he was working. The evening was very quiet. A whip-poor-will started somewhere down near the creek and then stopped, as though it too had decided this was not the moment. Annie, he said. He said her name the way you say the name of something you cannot replace and have not yet fully learned to live without. She was 6, he said. Diphtheria, winter of '83. She was gone in 3 days. Della did not say she was sorry. She did not offer any of the standard issue consolations that people reach for when they encounter grief of this size, not because she was indifferent to his pain, but because she understood in the way that only people who have spent time with real grief understand that those consolations do nothing for the person receiving them and serve primarily to make the person offering them feel less helpless. She sat beside him and let the silence hold what words could not. After a while, she asked, what was she like? And his face changed. It opened the way a door opens when the lock has been rusted for a long time, and someone has finally found the right key and turned it slowly enough that the hinges did not break. Stubborn hoy, he said. Lord, she was stubborn about everything. She had to be right next to me every minute she was awake, or she would set up a noise that would bring the horses in from the far pasture. She was going to have the biggest ranch in the territory, she told me. She told me that every single day, like she was afraid I might forget between one day and the next, and she needed to refresh the information. Something that was almost a smile moved across his face and was gone before it fully arrived. She sounds like someone who knew exactly what she wanted. She was the best thing I ever did, he said. His voice caught on the last word, held there for a moment, and then he breathed through it and continued. When she died, something died in me. Or I thought it did. My wife Ruth left 6 months after. Said she could not live in a house full of ghosts. I kept Annie's room exactly as it was, everything exactly where she left it. Ruth said I was holding on to a ghost, and she was not entirely wrong. I just did not know how to do anything else. You are not holding on to a ghost, Della said. You are holding on to her. Those are different things. Silas looked at her. Grief does not end, she said. It has to go somewhere. If writing letters to her is where it goes, then that is where it goes. There is nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong in any of it. He had not told her about the letters. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just discovered that a private room has a window in it that he was unaware of. Doc Fenwick, she said with something that was close to a wry smile. Then it faded. There is no wrong way to love someone who is gone, Silas. The only wrong is pretending it ended when it did not. He looked at the mountains for a longer time, the peaks against the sky going dark, old, and patient, and entirely beyond the scale of human difficulty. Then Della reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. Just her fingers. Light and deliberate, the way you place something you are not sure the surface will hold. He did not move. He let her hand rest there and felt the warmth of it and thought about how long it had been since anyone had touched him, with no agenda and no expectation and no need that the touch was meant to serve. They sat on the porch until the stars covered the sky from one ridge to the other and did not speak again. They did not need to. In Philadelphia that same evening, Cole Maddox's weekly telegram to Harrison Vane did not arrive. Harrison sat in his study and waited for it with the patience of a man who has spent his entire adult life arranging circumstances so that waiting is merely the interval between outcomes he has already determined. He was certain the telegram would come. Certainty was the state he maintained as a matter of professional discipline, the way other men maintain sobriety or fitness. He waited until midnight. The telegram did not come. Harrison Vane stood at the window and looked at the garden and felt something he had very little practice identifying because he had arranged his life to prevent its occurrence. The specific discomfort of a plan not proceeding as designed, of variables behaving in ways not accounted for in the calculation. He was a patient man. He had always been a patient man. But patience has an outer boundary, and he had reached it. He called for his man and told him to pack one bag. Enough for a week. He did not send a telegram. There was no point in announcing what was coming. Distance was not protection. Distance was the amount of ground between a man and what he intended, and he had covered ground before. The train left for Denver the following morning, and Harrison Vane was on it, sitting very still in his private compartment, with the stillness of a man who has made a final decision and is now simply waiting for geography to be resolved. Joseph Crow came down from the hills before dawn on a Friday. He came to the barn where Silas was already awake and already dressed because something in the air that morning had spoken to him in the language that weather speaks to people who have spent enough time outdoors to learn it. Joseph stood in the barn door and looked at him. "One carriage," he said, moving through the pen, driver in black, one passenger. He paused. "He comes alone." Silas felt the ground shift under him, not physically. In the architecture of everything he had been holding together for 3 weeks, something rearranged itself into a new and simpler shape. Fewer variables, one direction. "How long?" he asked. 48 hours, maybe a little less." Silas looked at the cabin, at the window of Della's room where the curtain was drawn, and somewhere behind it, a woman who had run 1,800 miles in a black wedding dress was sleeping without crying for the first time in years. "Stay close," he said. "I will be in the hills." Joseph turned and rode back toward the tree line and disappeared into it as completely as he always did, as though the mountains simply absorbed him. Silas went inside to make coffee. Della came into the kitchen at first light. She took one look at his face and set down the cup she had picked up and said, "He is coming." Not a question. 48 hours, Silas said. She stood still for a moment. Then she went to the bedroom and came back with the journal and set it on the table and sat down and looked at it with eyes that had moved past flinching. "Then we have 48 hours, she said. "Let's use them." Outside the kitchen window, the Colorado morning came in pale and clean over the eastern ridge, the kind of light that illuminates without mercy and without sentiment. The mountains stood where they had always stood. The creek ran where it had always run. And on the road between the pass and Holt's Crossing, moving through the dark with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never in his life been stopped by anything, a black carriage carried a man who had underestimated Della Weston once. He would not have the opportunity to do it again. He arrived on a Sunday. The church bell in Holt's Crossing was still marking the hour across the valley when Joseph Crow came down from the tree line at a hard run, his horse lathered and blowing, and pulled up in the yard with one word. "Now." Silas was on the porch. He had been there since before first light, with his rifle across his knees and a cup of coffee that had been cold for 3 hours, which he had continued to hold because holding it gave his hands an occupation that was not what they wanted to be doing. Della was inside. She had slept somehow in pieces. He had heard her up twice in the small hours, heard the creak of the board by the window, heard her return to the bed and the house go quiet again. She was stronger than she knew. She had always been stronger than she knew. The knowledge of your own strength is one of the first things taken from you when someone spends years convincing you that you have none. He stood when he heard Joseph's horse in the yard. Della appeared in the doorway before he turned, already dressed, already holding the journal in her left hand with the particular grip of someone who has decided, regardless of what happens in the next hour, that this object does not leave her hand. She had put on the black dress. She had not mentioned it. She simply wore it, and Silas understood without requiring explanation that the choice was deliberate in the way that only the most important choices are deliberate. She had arrived in that dress 6 weeks ago, running using the last of whatever she had to get away from the place she had been. She intended to be standing in it, not running, when Harrison Vane came through the gate. She was returning the story to where it started on her own terms in her own time. "One carriage," Joseph said, catching his horse, "coming up the South Road. Maybe 15-20 minutes. Silas looked at Della. She nodded. The small, firm nod of a person who has finished the deciding and moved into the place where you simply do. "Joseph," Silas said, "the hills." Joseph was already turning his horse. They waited on the porch. The morning was dry and still, the sky the particular pale blue that comes at altitude in summer, almost white at the edges deepening toward the zenith. The mountains stood in their permanent vigil over the valley with the vast and patient indifference of things that have witnessed everything worth witnessing and taken sides in none of it. A meadowlark worked the fence post at the edge of the yard. One of the horses stamped once in the corral. The creek ran its steady commentary over the stones downstream. Then the black carriage came around the bend in the South Road. It moved at the pace of certainty, not hurrying because hurrying implies the possibility of arriving too late, and this man did not operate in the space of that possibility. The horses were matched bays, well fed and matched in height, with the precision of an expensive purchase made by someone for whom expense is not a consideration. The driver wore black and sat straight and looked at nothing in particular. The carriage was city black, polished to a depth that was wrong against the brown dust and the wild sage and the honest, uncomposed plainness of everything around it, like something formal and cold that had been placed without permission in the middle of something that had never once pretended to be either. It stopped at the gate. The driver climbed down and opened the door. Harrison Vane stepped out into the Colorado morning as though stepping onto a stage he had arranged in advance. He was exactly what Della had described, and somehow in the specific gravity of his actual presence, more than description had been able to convey. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that spoke of money with the particular understatement of someone who understands that announcing money is what people without enough of it do. His face was handsome, the way the facade of an expensive building is handsome, constructed and symmetrical, and without the interior warmth that makes a face interesting rather than merely impressive. His blue eyes moved across the ranch with the automatic assessing attention of a man who prices things by reflex. The cabin, the barn with its slight eastward lean, the corral, the garden. Everything cataloged and valued and found beneath him in about 4 seconds. Then his eyes found Della. What happened to Harrison Vane's face was the most disturbing thing Silas had witnessed in 42 years of living through things. His expression softened. His eyes warmed. Something that looked from any outside vantage point entirely like the relief of a worried husband who has finally found the person he has been searching for moved through his features and arranged them into a portrait of loving concern. It was flawless. It was entirely practiced. It had absolutely nothing alive inside it. "Della?" His voice was warm and tired and full of a concern that his eyes, if you knew how to read them, did not share. "Thank God, I have been out of my mind." He walked toward the porch. "That is close enough," Silas said. His voice was quiet. It did not need to be loud. The rifle was in his hands with the ease of a thing he had been handling since he was 15 years old and knew as well as he knew his own hands, not raised, not performed as a threat, simply present the way tools are present when they belong to their context and their user. Harrison stopped. His eyes went to Silas with the rapid, specific attention of a man updating his assessment of a situation. The warm concern in his expression did not disappear. It became layered, the warmth on the surface, and underneath it, something that moved and recalculated with the speed of a machine that has been running for a very long time. "You must be Mr. Holt." His voice remained pleasant. The voice of a man who has never needed to be unpleasant to get what he wants, because pleasantness applied with precision has always been sufficient. "I want to thank you for taking care of my wife during what I can only imagine has been a very confusing time for her. She has always been," a pause so slight it was almost inaudible, "impulsive. She acts from feeling rather than from reason, and while I have always found it endearing, it does occasionally lead her to decisions she later has cause to reconsider. But I am here now, and I am certain we can resolve this without difficulty for anyone." "I am not going back with you, Harrison," Della's voice from the porch beside Silas. Steady and clear and carrying in the still air the way sounds carry at high altitude without effort and without distortion. Not raised, not defiant in any theatrical register. The tone of someone stating a fact about the world the way you state that the mountains are to the west or the creek runs north. Harrison tilted his head. The gesture was gentle and familiar. The gesture of a man who has practiced patience with the particular person in front of him and intends to demonstrate it again. "I know things have been difficult between us," he said. "I know I have not always been what you deserved. I have had time to reflect these past weeks, and I understand with more clarity than I have had before where I fell short and what I need to do differently." He reached into his jacket. Silas's right hand moved. Harrison noticed and opened one side of his jacket to show the interior pocket, the gesture of transparency. "Paper only, Mr. Holt." He withdrew a folded document and extended it toward the porch. "Divorce papers," he said. "My attorneys prepared them last week. Already signed. Full dissolution, no contest. Della receives her freedom. Her name, the complete restoration of everything she had before our marriage. Everything she asked for. Everything she wanted." He extended the papers. Neither Silas nor Della moved. The document hung between them in the morning air, like a white flag that everyone present understood was not a white flag. Della looked at the papers. Silas watched her face and saw the war behind her eyes. The war between 5 years of wanting exactly this document and the 5 years of education and what it cost to want things from Harrison Vane. Between the freedom those papers represented and what he was asking for in exchange. Between the part of her that had been waiting for this for 5 years and the part of her that had learned at great cost that nothing from his hands came without conditions written in smaller print. She looked at Harrison. "What do you want for them?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. The warm performance adjusted a small concession to the directness she had developed in 6 weeks of standing on ground that actually belonged to her. "There is a journal," he said. "A small leather book that went missing from my study the night you left. It is a private document, and it belongs to me. I would like it returned." He lowered the paper slightly. The offering gesture shifted into something else. "That is the complete arrangement. The journal for the papers. You receive your freedom. I receive my property. We walk away from this cleanly, and nothing in that journal ever needs to reach anyone else." The yard was very quiet. Della's hand moved to the pocket of the black dress. She pressed her palm flat against the journal through the fabric, and Silas saw in that gesture the full weight of what was being asked of her. The journal was the only leverage she had, the only thing between her and a man who had killed once and arranged the documentation to say otherwise, and had been entirely believed. Giving it back meant giving back the only evidence that Eleanor Vane had not fallen on her own. But the divorce papers were real. He could see the stamps and seals and signatures from where he stood. This was not a prop. This was the genuine instrument of everything Della had wanted. Harrison waited with the patience of a man who has closed 1,000 negotiations and understands that silence is the most effective pressure available to anyone who knows how to deploy it without appearing to deploy it. He did not fidget, did not push, stood in the morning sun with the papers in his outstretched hands, steady as a man who has always gotten what he came for and sees no compelling reason today should be different. Della looked at Silas. He looked back at her and held his face completely still. because this was her life and her war and her decision, and he had no standing to put any weight on either side of the scale. Whatever she chose, he would stand beside it. That was the only thing that had ever been his to decide. She turned back to Harrison. "No," she said. One word, one syllable. It dropped into the morning air and landed with the weight of something final and irreversible. Harrison blinked. A small fracture opened in the marble of his composure. Hairline. But Silas saw it, and he knew from having looked at it that underneath the silver hair and the tailored suit and the warm expert voice, something was pressing against the inside of the container that held it. "I beg your pardon?" "No." Della stepped forward to the top porch stair, which put her slightly above him, and neither of them missed what the geometry said. "I do not want your divorce papers. Not as a transaction. Not in exchange for something you want to use to protect yourself from Eleanor." Harrison's jaw tightened. The performance thinned. "Della, be reasonable." "I am being entirely reasonable." Her voice went lower and quieter and gained weight the way certain things gain weight as they go down, not less, but more. "I am not trading the journal, not for papers, not for money, not for any promise you have the capacity to make. What I am going to tell you is how this is going to end." She came down the remaining steps and walked across the yard toward him. Each step was deliberate. Each step covered ground that would have been impossible 6 weeks ago when she measured her safety in the distance she kept between herself and the nearest man who moved in her direction. Now she was the one moving. She stopped 4 feet from him, close enough to see the vein at his left temple, close enough to smell his cologne, that specific combination of cedar and something underneath it that had been in every bad dream she had carried out of Philadelphia, the smell of a life she had survived by crawling out of on her hands and knees. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the journal, opened it to page 47. "You are going to go back to Philadelphia," she said. "You are going to have your attorneys file for divorce on my terms. You are going to remove every legal instrument your lawyers placed on my ability to practice nursing. You are going to leave this ranch and this town and this state and never contact me again through any means you have available to you." Harrison stared at the open page, at his own handwriting. His face had gone the gray of ash, not pale but gray, the color of a fire after it has consumed everything that was available to it. "And if I decline," he said, the voice beneath the performance, what had been living underneath it all along, "then everything in this journal reaches every federal court and every newspaper of consequence in this country." Her eyes did not leave his. Not just the bribes, not just 20 years of corruption. Eleanor. Harrison flinched. It was small, a single involuntary twitch at the outer corner of his left eye, the kind of betrayal that happens when a muscle has been held too tight for too long, and a single word arrives with enough force to break the hold. A man who had spent 30 years controlling every expression on his face caught by a spasm he did not authorize at the sound of a dead woman's name. "She called your name," Della said. "Before she fell, you wrote it down. Page 47, between the bribe to Judge Calloway and the payment to the coroner. You wrote it because you believed no one would ever open that desk and no one would ever read those words." She closed the journal. "You believed that because you had decided I was not intelligent enough to find the key." Harrison looked at her. Something had moved behind his eyes that was not calculation and was not performance. It was the specific look of a man who has built his entire life on the absolute certainty that certain things are buried deeply enough to stay buried, watching that certainty develop a crack he cannot locate the beginning of. "You are bluffing," he said. "Am I?" Not a question. Harrison's hands, which had been at his sides, curled slowly into fists. The leather of his gloves pulled tight over his knuckles. He looked at the pocket where the journal had gone. He looked at the hills around the ranch where nothing visible moved and everything invisible watched. He looked at Silas on the porch. He stood very still, not the stillness of a man thinking, the stillness of a man who has already decided and is simply waiting for his hands to catch up to the decision. Then he reached inside his jacket, not for paper this time. The sound the pistol made clearing the leather was small and entirely ordinary, and it changed everything in the yard in the same instant it occurred. He did not point it at Della. He pointed it at Silas. "Put the rifle down," Harrison said, and his voice had been stripped of everything except the bare mechanical requirement of the instruction. Put it down slowly, Mr. Holt, or I will demonstrate that I have never had any genuine interest in negotiation. Silas did not move. Harrison cocked the hammer. I will not ask again. What happened next happened in the space of 2 seconds, and Silas would carry the image of it with the specific, undiminishing clarity that the most important moments insist on preserving, a clarity that does not soften with time, but becomes, if anything, more precise. Della stepped forward. She moved between the barrel and the porch, between the pistol and Silas, and she stood there in the black wedding dress in the morning sun, with her hands open at her sides, and she looked at Harrison Vane across 4 feet of Colorado dirt, with eyes that had spent 6 weeks remembering how to stop flinching, and had succeeded. Put it down, Harrison, she said. Step aside, Della. No, and I will not. You came here for the journal. Her voice was absolutely level. You cannot take it from a dead woman, and you cannot take it from me while I am standing between you and the only witness you actually came here to silence. She held his gaze. So you have a problem that the pistol does not solve. Something broke in Harrison's calculation. The pistol moved just slightly with the motion of a man whose certainty is fracturing faster than his control can compensate, whose hands are registering what his mind is not yet willing to accept. The shot went off. It went wide of Della. Wide enough that the sound was the most violent thing about it, an enormous crack that split the morning open and sent the meadowlark off the fence post in a burst of panicked wings and scared the horses in the corral into a brief thunder of hooves against the rails. The bullet caught Silas in the left shoulder, high and outside the joint, the kind of wound that drops a man without finishing him if the man has the discipline to manage the falling. He went down behind the porch railing with the controlled descent of someone who knows he is hit and is choosing where to land. Della did not turn around. She reached into her pocket and brought out the journal and held it open with both hands, page 47, facing Harrison Vane, and looked at him across the changed and ragged morning air. Shoot me, she said, and everything in this book is in Denver before your carriage reaches the pass. Harrison stared at her, at the open page, at his own handwriting on it, at the woman he had spent 5 years reducing to silence, standing in the middle of a ranch yard in Colorado, in the black dress he had used as an instrument of humiliation, holding his confession in both hands and not shaking. In the silence that followed the shot, Silas heard it before he saw it. The way you hear weather before it becomes visible. A sound from behind the tree line and from the south road and from the direction of town, all of it converging, resolving itself as he raised his head above the porch railing into footsteps. Many of them. Doc Fenwick came first with his medical bag over one shoulder and his old army revolver on his hip, and the expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to have arrived at a place past being frightened by any specific piece of it. Beside him, the blacksmith named Garrett, 6 feet 4 inches of a man carrying a sledgehammer across his shoulders the way a person carries something they have been carrying all their life and no longer notice the weight of. Behind them, the widow who ran the other boarding house in town with a shotgun that was older than she was and that she held with the relaxed competence of someone who knew exactly what it was for. The shopkeeper and his teenage son, 2 ranchers from the north end of the valley, a woman who ran the laundry on Prentice Street, a man who had been working a claim in the eastern slopes for 3 years and had not come into town for most of that time. 14 people, perhaps 15, moving up the south road in the morning light with whatever they owned that could serve the purpose, converging on the gate of the ranch with the quiet, implacable resolution of ordinary people who have made an extraordinary and irreversible decision. They stopped at the gate. Doc Fenwick looked at Harrison Vane's pistol with the expression of a man confirming information he already had. I think, Doc Fenwick said in the mild and measured tone he used for patients who were about to do something inadvisable, that you have made a significant miscalculation about what kind of town this is, Mr. Vane. Harrison looked at the line of faces at his gate, at the blacksmith with his hammer held across his shoulders like it weighed nothing, at the widow with her shotgun and the expression of a woman who had put 2 difficult men in the ground already and was not particularly exercised by the prospect of the arithmetic continuing. At 14 ordinary faces making no performance of their presence, simply occupying the road because they had decided to and intended to continue doing so. He looked back at Della. She had not moved. 2 more figures came through the gap in the people at the gate, Cole Maddox walking with his hat in his hands and his face carrying the expression of a man who has traveled a long distance to do something that is finally uncomplicated. And beside him, two men in the coats and badges of United States Marshals who moved with the particular unhurried authority of people who do not need to announce what they represent because it is immediately apparent from every other thing about them. Cole stopped a few feet from Harrison Vane. "Harrison," he said. Harrison looked at him, at the man who had worked for him for 11 years. His expression had finally run out of layers. What was left when the last one stripped away was not rage and was not fear, but something in between them, the recognition of a man looking at something his accounting did not include, and finding that without it, the accounting leaves him with nothing. "You," he said, "me." Cole's voice was even and carried no apology, because the time for that kind of apology was not now, and probably not ever, but what it did carry was the settled quality of a decision made fully and without remaining ambivalence. "I have been working for you for 11 years. I have done things in those 11 years that I expect to spend a considerable portion of whatever remains of my life accounting for." He paused. "This is the beginning of that accounting." He stepped aside. One of the marshals moved forward and said the words that marshals say when they have a warrant and a duty and a Sunday morning in which to execute both. The charges were read in the still air of the ranch yard while the mountains watched from every direction and the creek ran on below the meadow, and the meadowlark recovered from its alarm, returned to the fence post, and resumed its work. Bribery of public officials, conspiracy to commit fraud, and one count that had nothing to do with money, the count that had been 11 years building from the night a woman named Eleanor fell down a flight of stairs, and a man named Cole Maddox wrote a report that said nothing inconsistent with an accident and then spent 11 years not sleeping well. When the marshal finished, Harrison looked at Della. He did not speak. Perhaps the performance had finally used everything it had. Perhaps standing in a ranch yard in Colorado in the morning sun, looking at the woman he had spent 5 years erasing, while she stood in the dress he had weaponized and held the journal he had kept locked for 20 years, looking back at him with gray-green eyes that had stopped flinching was simply the end of something that could not be talked past. The marshals put the handcuffs on him. He did not resist. He was placed in the back of his own black carriage, and the carriage turned on the south road and went back the way it had come, growing smaller, with every yard trailing its dust into the blue morning, until it rounded the bend, and the sound of it faded, and there was only the creek and the wind and the horses settling in the corral and the meadowlark on its fence post singing into the morning, as though nothing had interrupted it and nothing had. Della stood in the yard and watched the dust after the carriage was gone. She watched until the dust settled and the road was just the road again, and there was nothing moving on it in either direction. Then she turned and went to the porch. Silas was sitting with his back against the railing, his right hand pressed to his left shoulder, his face the specific color of a man who has been shot and is managing the fact of it with more composure than is strictly warranted by the medical reality. He looked up when she knelt beside him. "Left shoulder," he said, "high and outside. Bullet went through clean. I have had worse." "You have not," she said, and her hands were already moving, and already opening his shirt with the quick and certain movements of someone who has done this before in the worst conditions than a ranch porch with good light and a cooperative patient. She examined the wound with her fingers and her eyes and the focused, unsentimental attention of a nurse who has held worse things closed with her bare hands in darker places than this. "Clean exit, you are right about that. You are going to need stitches, and you are going to follow my instructions exactly for 3 weeks, or we are going to have a serious and extended disagreement." "Yes, ma'am," Silas said. Something moved across his face that had nothing to do with his shoulder. Something that had been building for 6 weeks in the particular way that certain things build slowly and without announcement until the moment when they simply are. Cole Maddox came and crouched at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at Della with the eyes of a man who has just completed the first uncomplicated thing he has done in a very long time. "Miss Weston," he said. She looked up from the wound. "The warrant," he said. "The charges against Harrison. I want you to understand something about their origin." "You sent the financial records to the federal court," she said. "I did. 7 years of documentation from 7 years of watching his operation." He paused. "But the charges related to Eleanor. The testimony that opened the murder investigation specifically, That did not come from me. Della went still, completely still, the way a person goes still when something unexpected arrives that has significant consequences. Who sent it? She asked. Cole looked at something over her shoulder. She turned. Standing at the gate at the back edge of the crowd that was beginning to disperse with the particular quiet satisfaction of people who came to do a thing and did it and are now ready to go home, was a girl in a plain gray dress holding a piece of paper in both hands. Thin, watchful, brown hair cut practically short. Nettie Burke, 16 years old, who had walked up to the ranch 2 weeks ago, unable to write her own name, and had left on a Thursday afternoon with a pencil in her pocket and a folded sheet of paper in her dress, and the address of the United States Marshal's office in Denver, committed to the memory of her hand. She walked through the gate and across the yard and stopped in front of Della and held out the paper. Della took it. It was a letter. Written in the careful, deliberate hand of someone still learning the shapes of letters, each character formed with conscious attention, each word, hard-won the handwriting of a person who has only recently discovered that their thoughts can move from inside their head to outside it and remain there permanently. The letter was addressed to the United States Marshal's office in Denver, Colorado. It described in plain and specific language certain things that Nettie Burke had overheard during an unguarded conversation that a man named Cole Maddox had with someone he did not know was listening. It described what she had understood from that conversation and from 3 years of keeping her eyes and ears open in the boarding house while making herself invisible about a woman named Eleanor Vane and the manner in which she had come to fall down a flight of stairs. It asked that someone with the appropriate authority look into the matter. It was signed at the bottom in letters that were slightly larger than the rest of the text, large enough to be certain of being read. Nettie Burke. Della read the letter once, read it again. Then she looked up at the girl standing in front of her with her chin at the careful angle of someone trying very hard not to let hope be visible, because hope has historically been something that cost more than the benefit it delivered. You wrote this, Della said. You taught me, Nettie said. The letters, how they go together, how to make them mean something outside my head. She swallowed. I have been listening in that boarding house for 3 years. I know things. I have always known things. I just had no way to move them from inside to outside. A pause. You gave me a way to move them. Della looked at the letter in her hands, at the careful, uneven, effortful handwriting of a 16-year-old girl who had begun learning the alphabet 2 weeks ago at a kitchen table and had used that knowledge to do something that Della herself, with all her planning and all her courage and all the journals she had carried across 1,800 miles, had not been able to do alone. She had not sent copies of the journal to anyone. When she had told Harrison that she had standing 4 feet from him in the yard with his eyes on her and her hands not shaking, it had been a bluff. The threat of it had been real, but the copies had not existed. The murder charge, the specific thing that would follow Harrison Vane into every courtroom he entered from this point forward and would not allow him to buy his way to the far side of it, had not come from her. It had come from a girl she had taught to write her own name. Della set the letter carefully on her knee. She put both hands over her face. She held them there for a moment, and her shoulders moved once, and then she lowered her hands and looked at Nettie Burke with eyes that were very bright and very clear and completely open. Come here, she said. Nettie took the remaining 2 steps, and Della put both arms around her and held on. The girl went rigid for a moment, the specific rigidity of a person who has not been held in a very long time and whose body needs a moment to remember what to do when it happens. Then something released in her, and she leaned into it, and Della held on, and neither of them said anything, because nothing that needed saying required words. Doc Fenwick came up the porch steps and looked at Silas's shoulder with the expression of a man whose preliminary assessment has been confirmed and who is not pleased by the confirmation. Inside, he said, both of you, one needs stitches, and the other needs to sit down before her body makes the decision for her. I am not going to fall down, Della said. No, Doc Fenwick agreed, picking up his bag. You are not. You are the least likely person I have met in 35 years of practice to fall down. But you have been holding yourself together by main force for approximately 6 weeks, and I am going to insist that you allow someone else to carry some portion of that for the next hour. Inside, please. The stitches took 20 minutes. Della sat beside the bed and held Silas's right hand, while Doc Fenwick worked not because he needed her to, and not because he asked her to, but because she needed the specific solidity of his hand, and it was the most solid thing within reach. When Doc Fenwick finished and stood and gathered his instruments, he paused at the door with the expression of a man delivering the part of his instructions he already knows will be resisted. 3 weeks, he said to Silas, of rest that I am defining as the complete absence of ranch work, fence work, barn work, and any other category of physical labor you may attempt to reclassify as something other than those things. The horses. Joseph Crow is perfectly capable of keeping 5 horses alive for 3 weeks, Doc Fenwick said. I asked him this morning. He agreed before I finished the question. He looked at Della. Make sure he does what he is told. I will, Della said. Doc Fenwick nodded and went out, and the cabin settled into the quiet that follows a storm, the specific quiet of a world that has just finished processing something and is still in the early stages of understanding what comes next. Silas lay on his back looking at the ceiling. The light through the bedroom window was mid-morning, now level and clear, and undemanding, the kind of light that shows things as they are rather than as any particular angle might make them appear. Della, he said. She looked at him. Annie's room, he said. She waited. I want to open it, he said. He spoke carefully, the way you speak when you are trying to get the words to carry exactly the weight you intend them to carry, and no more budge to. I have been keeping it closed because I believed if I changed anything, I would lose the memory attached to that thing. If I moved her shoes, I would lose the specific way she left them. If I touched the drawings, I would lose the way she held the crayon when she made them. He stopped. His jaw worked once and then steadied. But that is not where she is. I understand that now. She is not in the room. Where is she? Della asked. He thought for a moment, not searching for an answer, confirming one that had been arriving in pieces over 6 weeks, arriving every time he scraped his boot on the porch step before entering, every time he put sugar in his coffee, every time he rode the north fence line. He did not need to ride. In the way I make noise before I come through a door, he said, because she used to startle easily, and I learned to warn her, and I never stopped. A pause. In the way I take sugar in my coffee, because she told me it was too bitter, and I changed it for her and never changed it back. In the way I ride the north pasture every morning, even when the fence does not need checking, because that was the ride she liked best, and I can still feel the weight of her sitting in front of me on the saddle. He looked at Della. She is in all of that. She is in me. Not in a room I have been keeping like a monument to something I am afraid of losing. Della stood. She walked out of the bedroom and down the hall and stopped in front of the closed door at the end. She put her hand on the knob and looked back at him. He nodded. She opened it. The room was small and still and full of morning light. The particular stillness of a space that has been undisturbed for a long time and has settled into its own quality of waiting. Dust moved slowly in the slant of light from the window. The small shoes by the door. The drawings on the walls, horses in the colors that children choose when they are not constrained by accuracy, purple horses and gold horses, and horses in an improbable green that is more vivid than any real horse, but more honest about how a 6-year-old experienced the things she loved. The stuffed bear on the pillow with its button eyes and its matted fur and its expression of absolute and unconditional patience. Della walked to the window and pushed it open. The air came in, mountain air, clean and sharp, and carrying the smell of pine and the creek and the wildflowers in the meadow below that only bloom in the brief Colorado summer and are gone before you fully appreciate them. It moved through the room the way good air moves through a space that has been closed for too long, touching everything, leaving everything where it was changing nothing except the quality of its presence. She went to the bed and picked up the bear. She held it for a moment, this small, worn thing that a child had loved until the fur was soft in all the places that hands returned to. She set it back on the pillow with the careful attention of someone placing something that has a place and belongs in it, not putting it away, not clearing it out, not making any declaration about what it signifies or how it should be held. Simply acknowledging that it has a place and the place is here, and here it will remain. She went back to the bedroom. Silas was watching the doorway. There, she said. Yeah, he said. He reached out his right hand and she took it, and they stayed like that for a while, not speaking, not needing to. While the light moved through the house and the open window at the end of the hall brought the mountain air through the length of it, touching every room, filling every corner, leaving nothing in the house untouched by it. That evening, Della cooked. She came back to the kitchen in a different dress. The black one was gone. She had taken it off in the bedroom and folded it with a care that was not sentiment, but finality, the way you fold something you are done with, but are not yet ready to discard. She would decide what to do with it later. For now, it was simply no longer on her body. The dress she wore instead was blue, plain cotton, the color of creek water in midsummer. Silas had left it on the chair outside her bedroom door 3 days ago without a word about it. She had not mentioned it either. She wore it now with the ease of someone putting on the first thing that had ever been entirely her own choosing. Not a reminder, not a punishment, not a ritual imposed from outside. Just a dress, just blue, just hers. She did not ask what he wanted. She went to the kitchen and looked at what was available and made cornbread, or from memory, without measuring the way you make something. You have made enough times that your hands carry the knowledge independently of your thinking. She seasoned the chicken with rosemary from the garden she had brought back from the edge of ruin and put it in the oven and set the table for two and lit the lamp against the Colorado dust that was beginning to come through the windows. Silas sat at the table with his left arm in the sling Doc Fennick had made from a clean cotton strip and watched her move through the kitchen. She moved differently than she had 6 weeks ago. The wariness was not gone. It was not going to be gone in 6 weeks or 6 months, or perhaps ever entirely, but it had changed its quality. It distinguished now between things that warranted it and things that did not. She moved like a woman who had remembered that the space her body occupies belongs to her, who had begun tentatively and carefully to take up her portion of the world. She hummed while she cooked. A tune without a name, the kind that emerges without intention from a person who has stopped monitoring every breath for its potential consequences and has started simply breathing. He had heard her hum before in the early mornings when she did not know he was close enough to hear. He had never mentioned it because he did not want her to become self-conscious about it. He understood that it was a sign, perhaps the most reliable sign available, that something inside her had decided this place was safe enough for music. The cornbread came out of the oven, and she cut it and put it on the table and sat across from him with the lamp between them and the mountains dark against the last light outside the window and the first stars coming out over the eastern ridge. Silas looked at the cornbread, at the table, at the kitchen that had been cold and empty and terrible in its quiet for 4 years, which was now warm and smelled of rosemary, and had a woman sitting across from him whose hands were steady and whose eyes were clear and who had stood in his yard today in a black dress and done something he did not have a word sufficient for. He picked up his piece and took a bite. It was perfect. The specific perfection of something made without effort because the effort has become invisible with practice. He said nothing because nothing he had available to say would improve on what the eating already said. Silas, Della said. He looked up. She was looking at him with those gray-green eyes that had traveled a very long distance from where they had been when he first saw them on the station platform 6 weeks ago. They still held what they had always held, the memory of it, the capacity for it, when circumstances warranted. But they held other things now as well. Things that had been there all along waiting for the room to exist in which they could be held openly. I came here with a false name, she said, in a stolen book, in a lie in every letter I wrote to you. She held his gaze without flinching from it. I am not the woman you sent for. No, he said, you are not. She waited. Grace Aldrin was a name on paper, he said. Neat handwriting and a photograph, and answers to the questions I had put in a letter. She was what I asked for. He set down the cornbread. Della Weston is the woman who brought my garden back from nothing, who knew what was in every bottle in a medicine box without being told, who sat across from me and told me the truth when it cost her everything to tell it, who stood in my yard this morning between a pistol and the man it was pointed at and did not move. He paused. I did not send for you, but you are what I needed, and I would like you to stay. Not as a mail-order bride, not as a woman with a complicated history with a man in Philadelphia. As Della. Just Della. Whatever that means and wherever it goes. She looked at him across the table with the lamp between them and the Colorado night pressing gently against the windows and the mountains standing there, ancient patient watch outside. Just Della, she said, is more than I have been allowed to be in a very long time. She reached across the table and took his right hand in both of hers. Her hands were warm and steady. The hands of a nurse who had held dying men's hands and set bones and made decisions in the space between heartbeats about who would live and who would not. The hands of a woman who had carried a leather journal across 1,800 miles in a black wedding dress and stood this morning between a pistol and the person it was pointed at and held her ground. The hands of a person who had been told repeatedly and with great confidence that she had nothing to offer and nobody who would want what she had, and who had spent 6 weeks quietly and thoroughly proving otherwise. Yes, she said, I will stay. Outside the ranch, the night settled into the valley the way Colorado nights settle completely and without ceremony, filling every low place with darkness, while the stars took the high ground above the peaks and the mountains stood in their old and patient shadow, doing what they had always done, which was to stand there and endure and make everything else look appropriately small by comparison. The creek moved in its steady course over the stones below the meadow. The horses were quiet in the corral. Somewhere up on the eastern slope, a coyote called once into the dark and then was silent, and the silence after, it was the silence of a place that has nothing left to prove. The lamp burned on the kitchen table. The cornbread sat between them. The rosemary smell moved through the house and out through the open window at the end of the hall and dispersed into the mountain air, where everything that passes through a place leaves some part of itself behind, some trace that the place carries forward into the next thing changed by the passing, even when the change is too small to see. In town, in the small room above Doc Fenwick's office that had been arranged quietly and carefully over the past 2 weeks by people who understood that some things required doing, without announcement, Nettie Burke sat on the edge of a bed that was hers, in a room that was hers in a town that was finally, and for the first time, a place she had some reason to consider staying. She opened a book that Della had given her, a plain book with large print and simple words and pictures of ordinary things named plainly beside them, the kind of book a person starts with when they are starting at the beginning, which is where Nettie Burke was starting, and which she had decided sometime in the past 2 weeks was not a shameful place to be. She turned to the first page. She read the first sentence, slowly moving her lips around each word the way you do when the words are still new enough that your mouth needs to practice them separately before you can hear them as a whole. She read it again faster. Then she turned pages carefully, one at a time, until she reached the page in the middle of the book where Della had written something in pencil in her clear and careful nurse's handwriting, a single sentence in the space above the printed text. Nettie Burke read the sentence. She read it again. She sat with the book open in her hands in the small room that was hers, and read those words a third time and a fourth until they had moved from something she was reading into something she knew the way. You know a thing when it has passed through reading into something that lives in a different place. You are not invisible. You never were. She sat with the book for a long time after that in the quiet room in the quiet town with the mountains visible through the window, doing what they always did. In the morning she would write a letter, to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone. A letter that was simply the practice of the thing, the ongoing work of making her thoughts move from inside to outside and stay there in the world where they could be seen. She was learning how.